So what is the collision in Korea? I am not talking about some sort of geopolitical event, though it was a geopolitical event. Uh, Not that many people know that. But the collision in Korea is a name given to a pro wrestling event that happened in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This is a regularly told story, but I consider it an untold story because outside of people who talk about wrestling, nobody really knows about it, but it's a pretty huge deal. So what was the collision in Korea? It was also called the Pyongyang International Sports and Culture Festival for Peace. It's very peaceful. The event was pay-per-view streamed in the U.S. In 1995. It was a collaboration between two very big wrestling companies, World Championship Wrestling, that some of you might have heard of, and New Japan Pro Wrestling. It was the first North American wrestling exhibition in the DPRK, and it's noted to be the biggest wrestling event in the history of the world. Between 150,000 and 190,000 people showed up each day for the 3 days of this event. It was held in the Mayday Stadium in Pyongyang. So the politics of this event was that it was 1995 was a very interesting year. It was the second year of the Clinton administration and 4 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. So initially, after the Soviet Union fell, there was this focus on the clash of civilizations to drive American foreign policy. But during the Clinton administration, there was a slight focus on trying to rebuild relations between various spaces. In particular, Japan and North Korea were not normalizing relations, but normalizing relations more than they had been in the past or since, relatively. And so this event was driven by Antonio Inoki, who I don't know if any of you know, but is a super legendary figure in the wrestling world. He was a big part of New Japan Pro Wrestling for a long time and had studied under famous National Wrestling Alliance world champions, which falls into this, which is that he studied under at that time, the unified Korean international wrestling champion, Ricky Dozan, who has a heroic status in both sides of the 49th parallel because of not only his connection to the land, but also because he was a legendary wrestler. So in part, this likely might not have happened had Antonio Inoki not studied under that wrestler, as the DPRK is historically very skeptical of bringing in anybody. But because of that connection, he was able to convince the leadership to bring him in. Obviously, a lot of the thoughts on the DPRK side of this is speculation because we really have no way of knowing what the motivations were. But there was an expectation that they were also participating in this to build relationships with the Clinton administration and to provide necessary entertainment to their citizens. So the event was held over 3 days. Several matches were put together into a pay-per-view and shared with the U.S. audience, which again is a historic situation. So some of the folks that were featured on this were Masahiro Chono, Bull Nakano, and Akira Hokuto, who were essential in repopularizing non-cis male professional wrestling in North America in the 90s. Both the World Championship Wrestling, WCW, and the World Wrestling Federation heavily relied on them and featured them when they were reviving different non-cis male-focused wrestling matches. So that was a pretty big deal. Shinya Hashimoto, who's the International World Grand Prix Heavyweight Champion, Road Warrior Hawk, rest in peace, of the Road Warriors or the Legion of Doom, depending on who you follow, and the Steiner Brothers. The main event was Ric Flair versus Inoki, and those of you who know Ric Flair. Does anybody know Ric Flair in the crowd? Can I get a woo for anybody who knows Ric Flair? No? Okay. Ric Flair was one of the famous U.S. champions at the time. So
look him up.
Yeah, look him up. Look up some of his promos. Diamonds are forever, and so is Ric Flair, as they say. Nobody says that, but he says that.
Well, you just said that.
Nobody other than me and Ric Flair says that. So it was despite it being a huge success, that no other event like that has happened since then. After the event happened, you know, things just got, hey, there's one person who knows Ric Flair. That's what I'm talking about. Do you know Arn Anderson too? Can I get some of these? Okay. So there was no follow-up events despite, again, historic attendance, and despite it being a huge deal. Relations between DPRK and Japan worsened, as they did with America as well. So one day, one of my dreams is to host such an event, maybe in North Korea, because it's hilariously cool. All right, we got a huge wrestling fan in the crowd. Maybe I should do more of these on various wrestling topics. I've always wanted to talk about NWO 2000, so maybe we'll do that. But yeah, so that's the collision in Korea. There's a lot of random, interesting history about wrestling, and it's related to Canada a lot, in that Canada is a huge wrestling company, especially outside of the cities, but also in the big cities. So there's a lot to cover, from Bret Hart to the history with the stadium in Toronto, not the Rogers Centre, but there's a stadium in Toronto that is famous for its connection to wrestling. So many famous wrestlers are Canadian. Current world champion Chris Jericho, for example. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot to talk about with pro wrestling, but I thought the collision in Korea was a good one to talk about.